Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And we begin Militancy, the highest form of alienation, by the Organization of Young Revolutionary Workers, or the OJTR, because I'm going to translate it from the French. The text was primarily written by Dominique Blanc, which is confusing because the most famous Dominique Blanc is not this Dominique Blanc, that's a French actress, but this Dominique Blanc was a man involved with La Militancy, or the Old Mole collective bookshop. La Militancy is somewhat infamous because while it was ultra left and was first inspired by Guy Debord and the Situationists International, then by Bordiga and also Council Communism. The La Militancy, and I'm going to use that because there's other old mole collectives, right, sought to reconcile the difference between the German left communist and Dutch left communist and the Italian left communist, so the councilist end versus the Bordigist/Domentist end. And La Militancy was closed in 1972, but came back in 1979 when Pierre Guillaumet brought it back, and they started publishing Paul Ransenier, who was an anarchist, who was in the camps, who became a Holocaust denialist, and La Militancy got associated with negationism, which also pulled from the text of it was published in a variance, but was not published by Bordiga, although it was misattributed to him, called Auschwitz: The Great Alibi, which was not a Holocaust denial piece either. It was one that just said that the Holocaust was an inevitable cost of capital. It's one of the most controversial texts, but it started the whole shift towards negationism, which really took off in France. Pierre Guillaumet, who was related to socialism or barbarism or socialiste or barbarie with Lyotard, really got into this negationism. But Dominique Blanc was linked to it himself when he wrote for La Guerre Sociale, which is the social war. And I'm just mentioning this and all this French obscure stuff because the Old Mole Collective was like the first attempt of one of many, including the 70s left communist international conferences, communization theory, which sought by means of a new theory to reconcile councilism and Bordigism. This was a big thing in France, the reconciliation of the two forms of left communism mentioned by Lenin in the 1920 report to the Comintern for the Second International Congress of the Comintern, where Lenin's executive report, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, was given out to everyone. And these circle Karl Marx and Dement and Bordiga are mentioned by name for their anti-electoralism, and then a large part of the text is aimed at councilists, although there's some parts of it that we don't ever mention that were named at National Bolsheviks. So there we go. Let's get into a little bit of the history of the OJRT. The OJRT wasn't around for very long. It came out of the post-68 milieu. It produced text under the name 250,000 Young Travelers. Excuse me, young workers. I keep on seeing travailleurs and forgetting that it's like travail, in English, or work, or trabajo in Spanish, etc., etc., etc. Right? But it looks like travelers. I'm just not looking. So if I screw up, forgive me. It's young workers. which was a youth publication of the Parti Socialiste Unifié, which was the French Socialist Party. The OJTR had a national conference in 1974, but completely fell apart afterwards. Then Dominique Blanc started publishing under the Friends of the 4 Million Young Workers, as opposed to the Organization of Revolutionary Workers. Between 1975-ish and 1976. In 1976, Blanc published in the King Kong International with former members of La Mouvement Communiste and people around La Miltancy, as well as the former members of the OJTR. And in that book, The Social War, they also started running negationist pacts by Rancière in conjunction with Pierre Goulet. So, unfortunately, this text that we're going to talk about today cannot be removed from the later specter of being negationist and having ties to Holocaust denialism and the left in France. And the reason for that denialism and negationism was to say that the Popular Front wasn't worth it. All right. I'm using the translation available for free on Libcom from this text. Now, some context for this text. This text actually from 1972. So it's a very early piece. It's way before the negationist stuff is really at play. And unfortunately, the translation at Libcom is a little bit botched because usually they put the notes at the bottom, and there's a lot of specific French groups that emerged and were suppressed after 68 in this, but sometimes they mix it in with the text. So it's a little confusing to get the pure text here, and I'll try to point that out where there's been a conflation. This text by the OJTR, are again, remind you what that is in English, the Organization of Young Revolutionary Workers, is from the context of 4 years out from 68 and the beginnings of like Malespondex and the French version of the New Communist movement and Trotskyist militants. This is a left communist critique of that and a movement away from anarchism and situationism by some of the post 68 milieu. All right. I read this text 10 years ago. I was initially impressed by it. I think today I'll probably have more to say negatively. And there is a sequel, which we will cover very soon. So there's a part 2 to this that was published, I believe, in 1974, right after the OJTR was dissolved. So let's get into this. Miltancy, the Highest Stage of Alienation, Part 1. All right. Since the occupation movement of May 68, we have seen a whole collection of small organizations claim to follow Trotskyism, Maoism, or anarchism, developing to the left of the Communist Party and the CGT. And the CGT is the official trade union, the Trade Union General, just to make sure. It's traditionally linked to the French Communist Party. Despite the tiny percentage of workers who join their ranks, they pretend to compete with the traditional organizations for control of the working class, of which they proclaim themselves the vanguard. All right, so this is the whole like communist front unions that don't have high membership but are claiming to speak for the entire working class. Back to text. The ridiculousness of their pretension might make you laugh, but laughter is not enough. It is necessary to look deeper to understand why the modern world produces these bureaucratic extremists and to tear away the mask of their ideologies in order to reveal their true historical role. As far as possible, revolutionaries must distance themselves from leftist organizations. Asterisk. This comes from the 50s period of Bourdieuism, where they start talking about the left of capital. And they lift the CPs post-Popular Front in that left. Okay, back to this. And show that far from threatening the world order, the action of these groups can at best only lead to its reconditioning. Starting to criticize them prepares the ground for the revolutionary movement, which will be obliged to liquidate them or risk being liquidated itself. The first temptation which presents itself is to attack their ideologies, to point out how archaic and exotic these, from Lenin to Mao, are, and to expose the contempt for the masses which lies behind their demagoguery. Or demagogy. I like demagoguery better, but I'll say demagogy because that's how they translated it. But when you consider these are enormous numbers of organizations and tendencies, all of them anxious to affirm their tiny ideological originality, this would soon become tiresome. Yes, it does, as I've tried to do with both Trotskyists, and maybe I'll one day try to do it with American Maoists. It's not a fun thing to do. And trying to keep up with what's going on behind the distinctions, both official and unofficial, is very hard. Back to text. Moreover, it would amount to placing yourself on their level. Rather than their ideas, it is more appropriate to take on the activity which they deploy in service of their ideas. Militancy. If we take militancy as a whole, this is not because we deny the differences which exist between activities of various organizations, but we think despite and even because of their importance, these differences can only be adequately explained by taking militancy as their origin. All right, but what do we mean by militancy here? Let's get to that. The various ways of being a militant are only different responses to the same fundamental contradiction, a contradiction which no one has a solution to. In taking the activity of the militant as a starting point of our critique, we do not underestimate the importance of the role of ideas within militancy. But from the moment that these ideas are put forward without any connection to activity, it becomes important to know what they conceal. We will show the discrepancy between them. We will connect the ideas to the activity and reveal the impact of the activity on ideas, seeking behind the lie the reality of the liar in order to understand the reality of the lie. Now, this is a big task, not going to lie, and I'm not sure this essay actually delivers to it. It's frankly not long enough, but it does get to something here, and we'll get to that in a minute. While the criticism and condemnation of militancy is an essential task for the revolutionary theory, it can only be done from the point of view of the revolution. Bourgeois ideologies can treat militants as dangerous hooligans or as manipulated idealists and advise them to occupy their time with work, or in getting away to Club Mediterranee, they cannot attack militancy in depth, for that would expose the misery of the activities permitted in modern society. We don't intend to hide our bias. Our criticism will not be objective and valid from all points of view. The critique of militancy cannot be separated from the construction of revolutionary organizations, not just because the organizations of militants will need to be fought without relaxation, but also because the struggle against the tendency towards militancy must be taken to the heart of even revolutionary organizations. Clearly, this is because, at least initially, the organizations are very likely to be made up from a significant portion of repented former militants, but it is also because militancy is rooted in the alienation of each one of us. Alienation is not eliminated by a magic wand, and militancy is the special trap which the old world sets for revolutionaries. Okay, so we have the left of capital. We have an almost Gorder, for those of you who don't know, that Herman Gorder, the council communist, who eventually even broke with Pannekoek and Co. because they thought that those council communist trade unions were too organizational. So there's almost this distrust of all non-spontaneous organization here. I don't know where that goes exactly. But it is interesting what they see as a subjective condition for revolutionary organization, and we'll get into that in a second because that's really what they're describing here. What we can say about militants is firm and without appeal. We are not prepared to compromise with them. These are not revolutionaries who have made a mistake, nor are they semi-revolutionaries. They are people who remain on the side. They are people who remain on this side of the revolution. Ouch. However, this does not mean, one, that we exempt ourselves from this critique, for if we made a point of being clear and sharp, we firstly do so in regards to ourselves. That's actually a good point. they actually do it. We'll see. Or two, that we condemn militants as individuals and make the condemnation a matter of morality. Yeah, that's a big problem. It is not a question of falling back on the separation of good from the bad. We don't underestimate the temptation to say, the more I mouth off about militants, the more I prove that I am not one, and the more I shelter myself from criticism. AKA special pleading and self-absorption. You should always watch out for that. I do think it's good that the writers realize that's a problem. Whatever other issues I have. Masochism. Let us try to overcome the boredom which militants naturally generate. We won't bother to decipher the phraseology of their leaflets and their speeches. Instead, let's question the reason which impelled them personally into militancy. There is no more embarrassing question for a militant. In the worst case, they will wither on indeterminately about the horrors of capitalism, about the misery of the third world children, about cluster bombs, about rising prices, about repression. At best, they will explain how, having once become conscious of the true nature of capitalism, how they value the famous raised consciousness, they decided to fight for a better world, for socialism, real socialism, of course, not the other kind. Filled with enthusiasm by the exciting process, they couldn't resist the desire to throw themselves on the handle of the nearest duplicator. Let's look deeper into this question and focus not on what they say, but on how they live. There is an enormous contradiction between what they claim to want and the misery and ineffectiveness of what they do. Yeah, I see this too, by the way. I mean, I have actually thought that when people, even people who are constantly complaining about why the leftists shoot themselves in the foot, like I think of the people critiquing Western Marxism, and then they go off and shoot themselves in the foot in similar ways. It's a very funny thing that you see all the time. This appeared to popularity in concessions, and then the same people alternating wildly between being hyper radical and hyper concessionary, being both ultra and tailist at the same time. And these are from people who consider themselves anti-revisionist or left communist or any number of things. Shit libs and rad libs, to use a common parlance, would also do the same thing. No, it's not enough to explain it that way. But yes, I mean, it's something to think about. And it is something to think about that maybe at some level, the ineffectiveness is actually part of the game. Because if they were effective, the organization would not need to be anymore. And I'm not saying that that's a conscious thing for most people. I would highly doubt it, but it does seem to be a thing that motivates them, like NGOs actually solving the problems that they set out to solve would endanger their existence, similar to the militant. All right, back to the text. The effort with which they demand of themselves and the degree of boredom in which they are capable of putting up with leaves no doubt. These people are primarily masochists. It is not just that in the view of their activity, one cannot believe that they sincerely want a better life. Yeah, I think that all the time, honestly. But that even their masochism shows no originality. Ouch. While certain perverts may put into a body of work and imagination which ignores the poverty of the old world's rules, this is not the case for militants. Within their organizations, they accept the hierarchy and petty leaders that they claim to want to rid the world of. Yes, I notice this a lot. There's a lot of guru cults that are filled with some of the most petty, uncharismatic fuckers who just can assert things over and over again until people believe them. Anyway, and the energy which they expend spontaneously takes on the form of work, because militants are a kind of people for whom 8 or 9 hours of daily degradation are not enough. Not enough that you get treated shitty on your job or at school. You got to go beyond that. When militants try to justify themselves, they will only succeed in showing their lack of imagination. They cannot conceive of something different, of a form of activity other than which currently exist. For them, the divisions between the serious and the amusing, between ends and means, are not tied to a specific period. These are categories held to be eternal and unsurpassable. One can only be happy later on by sacrificing oneself now. The sacrifice without the reward of millions of militant workers, the generations of the Stalinist period, stirs nothing in their tiny minds. They do not see the means determine ends, and by agreeing to sacrifice themselves daily, they prepare the sacrifices of tomorrow. Ouch. One cannot help but being struck by the innumerable resemblance which bring together militancy and religious activity. The same psychological attitudes can be found, the spirit of sacrifice, but also of intransience, the will to convert, yet also the spirit of submissiveness. The resemblances extend to the domain of rituals and ceremonies, sermons on unemployment, processions for Vietnam. I do sometimes think some of the protest stuff that we do uh, is almost ritualistic more than any evidence that is efficacious. I agreed with Nick Schreneck and Alex Williams in this way back in the day when they talked about like dead left habitats being maintained despite counter evidence. The references to the sacred texts of Marxist-Leninism, the cult of emblems, red flags. Don't the political churches also have their prophets, their great priests, their converts, their heresies, their schisms, their practicing militants, and their non-practicing sympathizers? But the revolutionary militancy is only a parody of religion. The richness, the insanity, the excesses of religious projects are beyond it. Militancy aspires to seriousness. It wants to be reasonable. It believes that in exchange for this, it can win paradise here below. It doesn't even achieve this much. Jesus Christ is resurrected and ascends to heaven. Lenin decomposes, well, at least gets pumped full of preservatives in Red Square. This is a facile comparison. One, because, you know, as I've pointed out before, many of these critiques of religion are really based off Christianity, or at least Abrahamic religions, but really mostly Christianity. But the other thing is, I mean, yeah, of course they do, because a lot of these social practices that we see in religion, and I put that in quotation marks, are often used in other things, not just politics. But there is a way in which secularization of religious impulses, or of these kinds of impulses towards the sacred, do end up in a kind of shallow and facile ideological militancy that's really about belief structures. Anyway, if the militant can be compared to the believer in terms of the ingenuousness of his illusion, it is another matter in regard to his real attitude. The sacrifice of the Carmelite nun who imprisons herself to pray for the salvation of souls has a very limited effect on social reality. The situation is quite different for the militant. His sacrifice is likely to have distressing consequences for the whole society. That may be giving them too much credit, although if Twitter discourse is an indication, maybe he's right. The desire for promotion. The militant talks a lot about the masses. His activity is centered on them. He acts to convince them, to make them achieve consciousness. And yet the militant is separated from the masses and their possibilities for revolt. This is because he is separated from his own desires. Now we got some good old ad hoc psychoanalysis with no real basis. A long leftist tradition. Anyway, the militant feels the absurdity of the existence imposed on us. In deciding to become a militant, he tries to find a solution to the gaps which exist between his desires and the life which he really has a possibility of living. His decision is a reaction against the misery of his own life, but he commits himself to a dead end. Although he is dissatisfied, the militant remains unable to recognize and face his desires. He is ashamed of them. This leads him to replace the promotion of his desires with the desire for promotion. Nice little flip of phrase there. But the feeling of guilt, which he maintains are such that he cannot contemplate a hierarchical promotion within the framework of the system, or rather, he is only ready to fight for a good position, if at the same time he can attain an assurance that this is not just for his own benefit. Yeah, we see this more. I see this more in NGOs than in militancy, but I definitely see it. The people who feel like they need to earn their living by doing something good. I earn my living, by serving the people. Sure, I'm a teacher, right? But I'm of no delusion about what social role I play. Or like what this channel does, which is just educational. It's not, properly speaking, political. All right. His militancy enables him to elevate himself, to place himself on a pedestal without this promotion appealing to others or even to himself as what it really is. After all, the Pope himself is only the servant of the servants of God. Putting oneself at the service of one's own desires doesn't mean retreating into one's shell. It has nothing to do with petit bourgeois individualism. On the contrary, it can only proceed from the destruction of the armor of selfishness, which confines us in bourgeois society, and the development of a true class solidarity. There's a whole lot of individual focus in this text that I think is kind of weird, considering we're supposed to be talking about material conditions. Anyway, the militant who claims to place himself at the service of the proletariat, the workers are our masters, Gesmar. All right, that's Alain Gesmar, a member of the Unified Socialist Party, which was a left socialist party, and the president of University Teachers Union in May of '68. Gesmar became one of the most prominent personalities created by the May movement. After it ended, he became close to the March 22nd movement, and in early 1969, along with other members, he joined La Gauche Prolétaire, the leading group of activists wing of French Maoism. We'll get back to them in a minute. He became a public spokesman of GP and a cause célèbre in his own right when he was imprisoned in 1970 for incitement to riot. In later years, he was able to resume his career as an academic, and by the end of the century, he was a ministerial advisor to a socialist government. All right. That happens a lot. It's not like Gene Kwan, the Uber Maoist, becoming mayor of Oakland. All right. Only places himself at the service of the idea which he has of the proletarian's interests. After all, we serve the proletarian for themselves, not the proletarian in themselves. We don't need the actual proletariat, just what we project that they should do. See Lukács. Thus, by paradox, which is only apparent, in truly putting himself at the service of oneself, he comes back to helping others, and doing so on a class basis. While placing oneself at the service of others, he comes to protect his personal hierarchical position. You're still a functionary, my bro. To be militant does not mean trying hard to transform one's daily life or directly revolting against oppression, but on the contrary means fleeing this terrain. Yeah, this is why I think not like this is a militant as a free-floating definitional insult. So yeah. However, once it is understood that our everyday life is colonized by capital and ruled by the laws of commodity production, this is the only revolutionary terrain. And politicizing oneself, the militant is in search of a role which places him above the masses. Whether this above takes the form of vanguardism or of educationism changes nothing. They pretty much mean the same thing, by the way. He already is no longer a proletarian who has nothing to lose but his illusions. He has a role to defend. In the revolutionary periods, when all roles crumble under pressure from the desire to live without restriction, the role of conscious revolutionary is the one which survives best. In being militant, he gives substance to his existence, and his life finds meaning. However, he does not find meaning within himself, in the reality of his subjectivity, but in submission to external necessities, in the same way that at work he is subjected to the goals and rules which escape him. As a militant, he obeys, quote, the necessities of history, unquote. Obviously, one cannot put all militants on the same level. Not all of them are deeply affected. Among them, one finds naive individuals who, not knowing what they do with their spare time, possessed by loneliness and deceived by revolutionary phraseology, are led astray. They will seize the first excuse to leave, like most of the people in the 80s did to the new communist movement. All right, anyway, buying a television, meeting your heart's desire, working overtime to pay for the car, all decimate the ranks of the militant army. The reason which impale people into militancy are not products of modern society. On the whole, they are the same for the militant trade unionists, Catholics, and revolutionaries. The reappearance of the revolutionary mass militancy is related to the current crisis of commodity societies and the return of the old mole of revolution. The possibility of social revolution appears sufficiently serious that militants take a gamble on it. This is all reinforced by the collapse of religions. Capitalism no longer needs systems of religion compensation. Having arrived at maturity, it no longer has to offer an extra portion of happiness in the hereafter, but all happiness in the here below, through the consumption of its material, cultural, and spiritual goods. Metaphysical anguish promotes sales. After all, see all the New Age shit that we have today that replaces religion without any religion. Bypassed by history, the religions and their faithful can only move on to social action or Maoism. Ouch, ouch, ouch. Leftist militancy primarily affects those social categories which are in the process of accelerated proletarianization, what we call the downwardly mobile PMC. I don't like the PMC category, but I actually think this is true. High school pupils, students, teachers, social economic personnel, white collar workers, and students who have no possibility of fighting concretely for short-term advantages, and for whom to become truly revolutionary presupposes a very profound personal reassessment. The worker is much less complicit in his social role than the student or teacher. For the latter, being a militant is a compromise solution which enables them to shoulder their fluctuating social role. In militancy, they find an importance that the deterioration of their social standing denies them. To call themselves revolutionaries, to occupy themselves with the transformation of the whole society, permits them to minimize the transformation of their own social status and personal illusions. Ouch, 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 ouch. This one kind of hits home to me, even though I don't consider myself particularly militant. Within the working class, trade unions have a virtual monopoly on militancy. It assures that the militant infinite satisfaction in a position whose advantages can be concretely measured. This is the councilless hatred of business and or guild unions, and they consider pretty much all unions to be business and or guild unions. The worker who is tempted by militancy will most probably turn to trade unionism. Even the anti-union committee of struggle tend to become new style trade unionism. This is the workers' committees of struggle. Like Occupy, we don't really have them anymore. For militant workers, politics is only an extension of the trade union action. Militancy hardly attracts workers, especially young workers, since they are the most clear-sighted proletarians when it comes to the measure of their work in particular and of their life in general. Little tempted as a whole by trade unionism, they are less attracted by the nebulous advantages of leftism. That's not true today, bro. Although they're trying to talk about young workers being less given to this than students. All right. That's who's being compared here. And of course, they call themselves the Organization of Young Workers. That said, when the reign of the commodity of consumption dissolves during the revolutionary upheaval, trade unionism, whose importance is based on the wage demand, that's true, will be ready to survive by turning to revolutionary militancy. It will take up the most extreme slogans and will then be much more dangerous than leftist groups. Following May 68, we have already seen how the CFTD blended the term self-management into neo-bureaucratic gibberish. The Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail are the French Confederation of Democratic Workers, or the French. Anyway, French Trade Union Federation after '68, which it was more sympathetic to than the Communist Party linked to the CGT. It developed strong ties to the Parti Socialiste Unifié, Unified Socialist Party. It became strongly identified with the cause of worker self-management, autogestion, in the years later moved closer to the Socialist Party. That's from the translator. Political work. The militant devotes his free time, which his professional educational obligations leave him, to what he calls political work. It is necessary to print and distribute leaflets, manufacture and stick up posters, hold meetings, make contacts, prepare rallies. But this sort of activity is considered in isolation if not enough to characterize militant work. The simple fact of composing a leaflet with the aim of printing and distributing it cannot in itself be considered a militant act. It becomes militancy, if it becomes militancy, is because it forms part of the activity which has a particular logic. What particular logic, my friend Dominique? It's because the militant activity is not an extension of his desires. It's because it obeys a logic which is external to him, that it approaches work. Just as a worker does not work for himself, the militant is not a militant on his own behalf. Thus, the results of his own action cannot be measured by the pleasure he gets from it. Instead, it will be a number of hours spent, the number of leaflets distributed. Repetition and routine dominate the activity of the militant. The separation between execution and decision reinforces the civil servant aspect of the militant. But if militancy approaches work, it cannot be assimilated to it. Work is an activity on which the dominant world is based. It produces and reproduces capital and capital's relations of production. Militancy is only a minor activity. By definition, the results and effectiveness of work are not measured by the satisfaction of the worker, but they have an advantage of being economically measurable. Commodity production, by means of currency and profit, creates a standard and instruments of measure. It has its own logic and rationality, which it imposes on the producer and the consumer. By contrast, the effectiveness of militancy the advancement of the revolution still hasn't found its measuring instruments. Their control evades militants and their leaders, assuming, of course, that the latter will worry about revolution. So they are reduced to counting materials produced and distributed, the levels of recruitment, the number of actions that are taken. Obviously, none of these measures are what they pretend to. Naturally enough, from this, they come to imagine that this is what is measurable is an end in itself. Imagine a capitalist who could not find the means of evaluating the value of his production and so settled for measuring the quantity of oil consumed by machines. Conscientiously, workers would empty the oil into the gutter to produce an increase in production. Incapable of pursuing its proclaimed goal, militancy only gives itself the name of work. As they conscientiously endeavor to imitate work, militants are very badly placed to understand the prospects which are opened up, on one hand by increasingly widespread contempt for all constraints, and on the other by the progress of knowledge and technology. The most intelligent of them line up alongside modernist bourgeois ideologists in order to demand that the hours of work are reduced or that their repugnant activity is humanized. Whether they speak it in the name of capital or of revolution, these people are incapable to see beyond separation between work time and leisure time, between activity devoted to production and activity devoted to consumption. If we are obliged to work, the cause is not natural but social. Work and class go hand in hand. The master wants to see the slave producing only because what is produced can be appropriated. The capitalist doesn't give a shit for the joy or pleasure which can be found in the activity and which cannot be capitalized, accumulated, or translated into money. Well, maybe it can, actually. We're getting good at translating experiences into rents, but we'll come back to that later, maybe. Anyway, when we work, we are entirely subjected to authority, to an external law. Our own reason for existence is what we produce. Any factory is a racket where our lives and our sweat are squeezed out to be transformed into commodities. Time spent at work is in which we cannot directly satisfy our desires, but which instead we must sacrifice while waiting for the subsequent compensation of a salary. This is exactly the opposite of play, where the unfolding and rhythm of what you do is led by the pleasure you take in it. In emancipating itself, the proletariat will abolish work. The production of foodstuff necessary for our biological survival will no longer be anything but the pretext for the liberation of our passions. I've always wanted to believe that, but that seems wildly optimistic to me. Obsession with holding meetings. Yes. A significant characteristic of militancy is the time spent in meetings. Let's leave to one side the debate devoted, to grand strategy, where our comrades in Bolivia, when will we have the next world economic crisis, is in the construction of the Revolutionary Party being advanced. Instead, let's be content to consider these meetings concerning, quote, everyday work. It's perhaps in these that the misery of militantism is best displayed. Aside from a few desperate cases, militants themselves will complain of the number of these meetings which make no progress. Even though a militant likes to bask in each other's company, they cannot fail to suffer from the obvious contradiction between their will to act on one hand, and on the other, the time wasted in fruitless discussions and endless debate. They are condemned to remain in the dead end because they are only attacking meeting-itis. Without seeing it is the whole of militancy which is called into the question. The only way to have the ending, the obsession with meetings, accounts to retreating into activism with less and less grasp on reality. What is to be done? How should we organize ourselves? These are questions which underlie and give rise to meetings. However, these questions can never be settled and their solution gets no closer because militants put them to themselves. They pose them as if they were separate from their own lives. Answers are not found because the questions are not raised by those who possess the concrete solution to them. That's fair enough. You can meet for hours and rack your brains, but you won't conjure up practical support when ideas are lacking. While these questions are trifles for the revolutionary proletariat, because for them the problem of action and organization arise concretely and form part of their struggle, for the militants they become the problem. An obsession with meetings is a necessary complement to activism. In fact, the problem which arises is always the same: how to merge with the mass movement while remaining separated from it. Ouch, yeah. The solution to this dilemma is either for them to truly merge with the masses through finding the reality of their desires and the possibility of their realizations, or else to reinforce their power as militants while lining up against the proletariat at the side of the old world. Wildcat strikes show that there are risks. Militancy reproduces its internal failings and its relationship with the masses, in particular, its obsession with meetings. You gather people and you count them. For groups like the AJS, to present themselves and to count heads becomes the height of action. Right, who are the AJS? The Alliance of Youth for Socialism, founded in 1969 as a youth movement. The Lambertus Organization Communist Internationalists, OCI. In 1968, the OCI was the most old left of the French Trotskyist groups. It was a member of the International Committee of the Fourth International along with the Healyite Socialist Labor League until it broke with Healy in 1971. It achieved a number of feat of calling in young people to tear down the barricades in 1968 and then getting them briefly banned by the government. Its youth ring, the AJS, acquired an enviable reputation for manipulative frontism. See Roland Barthes, the Dictionary of the Extreme Left of 1974, Paris 1978, and Binden Field's Trotskyism and Maoist Theory and Practice in France and the United States, Autonomia, New York, 1988. I have that book back there. It's quite good, although it is dated. Because I believe it's from the 80s. Yeah, it's 88. I just read that. All right. These questions of action and organization already separated from the real movement are then mechanically separated from one another. The various tendencies of leftism concretize this separation. On one side, we might find the Maoists in the former Gauche Proletaire, the pole of action. On the other side, we might find the Trotskyists in the Ligue Communiste, the pole of organization. In order to leave the dead end, which militancy is pledged into separating from the masses, either fetishize action or fetishize organization. Each protects its particular idiocy when mocking the orientation of rival groups. All right, let's go into these two groups. The Gauche Proletaire was formed in 1968 by former members of the Union of Young Communists, Marxist-Leninists, and Althusserite Maoist group, which split from the UEC, the Communist Party's official student group, in 1966. At the start in 1969, they were joined by a number of members of the spontaneous March 22nd movement, Malspondex, that's fun. And for the next 3 or 4 years, the GP became the most representative group within non-party Maoism. This current, which had few parallels outside of France, this is Malspondex, is described in detail in A. Baden-Field's book, great book, including Sartre and the publisher Mas Perot. GP was characterized by a number of personalities which it attracted as sympathizers, including Sartre and the publisher's Mas Perot. A lot of the existentialists and post-structuralists were tied to it at one point, which it created in France to simplify the practice of radical chic. Its organization practice exemplified what became in the US and UK the tyranny of structuralistness. Banned by the government in 1970, the GP continued through the variety of fronts and networks of groups attempting to take over control of other projects. See the books in question. The Ligue Communiste, if the OCI, see footnote above, represented the old left within Trotskyism, Liga Communiste represented the new left, basing itself on the new vanguards of youth, students, and black nationalism and national liberation movements. Liga Communiste was a name adopted in 1968 by the Frankist Parti Communiste International, PCI, and the Young Communist Revolutionaries, JCR. The student group it dominated were banned by the government. As a first section of the Unified Secretariat of the Fourth International, the PCI had practiced intrusionism into the French Communist Party until 1968. Its influence inside the party's official student groups led to the formation of the JCR in 1967. JCR was one of the most active student groups during May 68, and its successes promoted itself as a springboard for the formation of the Liga. Bureaucracy. Organizations and militants are all hierarchical. Some organizations do not hide this fact, but pride themselves in it. Others are content to talk about it as little as possible. Finally, let's put some small groups try to deny it altogether. Some of the small groups try to deny it altogether. In the same way they reproduce, or rather ape work, militant organizations also have a need for bosses. Unable to build their unity starting from concrete problems, militants are naturally led to believe that the unification of decisions can only result from the existence of leadership. They don't imagine that a common truth can emerge from particular wills, or as they see it, can come out of the shit. Instead, it must be weighted and imposed from on high. So by necessity, they represent a revolution as a clash between two hierarchical state apparatuses, one bourgeois, the other proletarian. Ouch. They know nothing about bureaucracy, about its autonomy, or the way in which it resolves its internal contradictions. Grassroots militants naively believe that the conflicts between leaders can be reduced to conflicts of ideas, and that when they are told there is unity, there is indeed unity. Their great pride is to have been able to distinguish organizations provided with the best leadership. While adhering to this or that chapel, they will adopt a system of ideas in which is the same way as one slips a costume. Without having verified its basis, they will start to ready to defend all of its consequences and respond to any objections with incredible dogmatism. At a time when priests are torn by spiritual crisis, militants keep the faith. Ouch. Forced to take account of increasingly widespread contempt for any form of authority, militancy produces the offshoots of a new kind. Some organizations claim not to be organizations and in particular conceal their leadership. I have been in this where there's formal leadership and that's not who really is control. It's really a cult of personality. And the formal leadership actually backs up the informal leadership. Or I've just seen where that they refuse to have it, but there's just dominant personalities like in anarchist houses. The bureaucrats hide themselves while all the better to pull the strings. Some traditional organizations try to set up parallel forms of organizations, some permanent, some not. This is frontism. They hope in the name of proletarian autonomy to co-opt at least some influence on people who would otherwise have escaped them. One can mention the Secours Rouge, the OJTR, and the Assembly aux Paysans de PSU. Okay. Here's the note. The note, for some reason, here is just in... this is here. This is not the original text. I just want you guys to know this. I want to read it. But this whole section is actually author's notes and aren't denoted as that. And we know this because the citations are from a decade later than the piece. Actually, more than that. All right. Secours Rouge Red Age was formed in 1970 by the Committee of Militant Personalities, BIARD, including the ubiquitous Sartre. Its purpose was to be a unitary body for organizing practical defense and struggle, theoretically to be controlled by popular local meetings. It attracted the support of a number of Trotskyist, Maoist, and anarchist groups and organized activities ranging from demonstrations to attempts at practical solidarity of different kinds. In reality, Secours Rouge was primarily an initiative by the Maoist GP, we already talked about them, which by then had been banned by the government and existed through a network of groups and organizations which either started itself or was else co-opted. See the footnote 5 where I talked about that. The scene of infighting amongst various groupings from the start, one by one the Trotsky troops left, the socialist SPU broke away, leaving the militants of the ex-GP in control before it broke up completely. Very much like the SDS. Assemblies Ouvriers Paysans de PSU, which is the left assemblies of partisans of the party of the Unified Socialists, was a small left socialist party formed in 1960. Strongly divided over the direction following the 1969 elections and facing strong pressure from sections with membership, it had picked up a lot of younger and more militant recruits following May 68. The party's national council decided to convene the Assembly of Workers and Peasants, us peasants, okay, yeah, workers and peasants, across the country. So, the novel element was that these would be open to non-members of the party and would be charged with formulating strategy documents to go to the party's Congress at Lille at June 1971. Unsurprisingly, the assemblies promptly became a scene of infighting for control of various factions of the party, and the text went on. And the text, which finally went to the Congress, represented factions rather than the voice of the struggling masses. The JTR were groups which produced this text. Presumably, this is either a joke by the authors or a misprint in the version which have been translated from. Either way, some independent newspapers or satellite organizations claim only to express this point of view of the revolutionary masses or of the autonomous rank and file groups. For example, the Cahiers, I don't know that word, of May, the La Technique and Lutte and Lever des Travailleurs. I don't speak French, guys. And there's a footnote and a footnote. All right. Cahiers de May is a journal founded in 1968 by some militants around Nantes, which originally set out to express the viewpoint of the action committees formed in May. As the movement sprang into being during May 68 died away, the journal became a forum for discussing and popularizing worker struggles. In January 1969, it initiated a debate on the theme, how can we help the workers take revolutionary action? This debate involved workers as well as militants, and a number of study groups were set up. In 1972, as an attempt was made to formalize this through association of the Friends of Cahiers de Mai, I guess, devoted to championing new forms of organization and action and promoting autonomous struggle. Dear French speakers, I'm sorry what I've done to you today. This is an act of violence. Anyway, however, as Bayard puts it, quote, the notion of autonomy of the working class is closely bound to the notion of the organization of revolutionaries. When the relations between the autonomous movement and the revolutionary groups, depending on the answer one gives, the negation of the revolutionary groups to the recognition of the vanguard role, there is an infinity of possible positions. The journal ceased publishing in 1979. All right, let's go back to our footnote within a footnote. All right. When people refuse to raise the question of organizational theory, our pretext for the hours of construction of the Revolutionary Party has not yet arrived. Are in the name of, okay, so I'm just going to look at this. This should be I believe, this is no, and then this is the text. And so in the same way some independent newspapers out organization, yeah, this is the original text. I don't know why they botched this so bad. All right. Refuse to clarify the organization or theory on the pretext of the hour of construction of the Revolutionary Party has not yet arrived, and the name is bogus spontaneism. We are not an organization, but a gathering of nice guys, a community, etc., etc. One can be certain that there is a bureaucracy, and quite often that this one is dealing with Maoism. The advantage of Trotskyism is that its fetish of the organization forces it to display its true colors. It co-opts while saying that's what it's doing. The advantage of Maoism, and we're not speaking here of pure archaeostanist Maoism of the Humanité Rouge variety, is that it creates the conditions of its own supersession, playing at being an acrobat of co-option which will certainly tumble to the ground. Ouch. The Humanité Rouge, Red Humanity, is the journal of the Parti Communiste Marxist Leninist of France, centralized Maoist party formed in December 1967 by a number of former communist members. Unlike the R2 Sarai UJCML, which broke with the CP student group and was of the seedbed for non-party Maoist currents such as Gauche Protélinaire, the GP, the PCMLF was primarily composed of ultra-Stalinist, opposed to what they saw as revisionism of the CP. Active during May 68, it was banned like many other organizations and subsequently operated clandestinely. Its public face became that of its journal, Humanité Rouge. All right, there we go. So we have Mao Spondex versus Mao Ultra Anti-Revisionist. You know, Maoism has always sprinted like this, even before it was formalized into like 5 or 6 different subtrends. It's that it creates the conditions for its own supersession, playing the world act-backs of co-option while they were certain turned to the ground. Objectivity and subjectivity. All right, the good old Leninist debate. The systems of ideas adopted by militants vary amongst the different organizations, but they are all undermined by the need to mask both the nature of the activities they conceal and their separation from the masses. So at the heart of the militant ideologies, one finds a separation between the objectivity and subjectivity conceived in a mechanical and ahistoric manner. This might be an attack on Austin Sayer, right out. Anyway. Even if he does not deny that this is his activity, his subjective motivations, the militant who devotes himself to the service of the people refuses to attach any importance to them. In any event, what is subjective must be eliminated in favor of what is objective. Refusing to be driven by his desires, the militant is reduced to invoking historical necessity. Considered as something external to the world of desires, thanks to, quote, scientific socialism, unquote, the concealed form of degenerated Marxism, he believes he has the power to discover the direction of history and to adapt himself to it. He gets struck on concepts whose significance escapes them: productive forces, relations of production, law of value, dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. It all enables him to reassure himself about the seriousness of his agitation. Setting himself aside from his critique of the world, he condemns himself to understand nothing of its movement. The passion, which he does not manage to put into his everyday life, he displays on his imaginary participation in the world revolutionary spectacle. The earth is reduced to the level of a Punch and Judy show, where the nasty and the nice, the imperialist and the anti-imperialist clash. Ouch. He compensates for the mediocrity of his existence by identifying with the stars of this planetary circus. Ouch, ouch. At the height of the ridiculousness was the worship of Che. Nutty economist, pitiable strategist, but good-looking guy, at least Rivera would have the consolation of seeing his Hollywood-style talents rewarded. A record in poster sales. Ouch. What is subjectivity other than the residue of objectivity, which a society based on commodity production cannot integrate? The subjectivity already subjectifies itself in the work of art. For the worker who is separated from the means of production and from the organization of his own production, subjectivity remains a state of mania, of fantasy. He is made objective by the grace of capital. It even becomes capital. Work is a form of capital. Revolutionary activity like the world it prefigures goes beyond the separation between objectivity and subjectivity. It objectifies subjectivity and subjectively invests in the objective world. The proletarian revolution is the interruption of subjectivity. It is not a question of falling back on the myth of real human nature or the eternal essence of man repressed by society, and which would seek to return for all to see. But if the form and goal of our desires vary, they cannot be reduced to the need to consume this or that product. Historically determined by evolution and necessities of commodity production, subjectivity by no means yields to the needs of consumption or production. Commodities must constantly adapt in order to be co-opted to the desires of consumers, but they still remain unable to satisfy the will to live completely and directly by achieving our desires. Shop windows, the avant-garde of commercial provocation, increasingly undergo the critique by paving stone. This is very 1960-80. Those who refuse to take account of reality of their own desires in the name of materialist thought risk not seeing the weight of their desires land in their face. Militants and their ideologists and even university undergraduates are less and less capable of understanding that they're on time and of being consistent with history. Incapable of secreting a thought that's the slightest bit modern, they are reduced to searching the dustbin of history, co-opting ideologies which have long since given the evidence of their failure. Anarchism, Leninism, Trotskyism. To render this more digestible, they season it with a little badly understood Maoism or Castroism. They invoke the name of the workers' movement, but refuse its history with its construction of state capitalism in Russia or peasant bureaucratic effort in Walmart in China. They claim to be Marxist, but understand the Marxist project for the abolition of wage labor. Commodity production in the state is inseparable from the seizure of power by the proletariat. Marxist thinkers who are increasingly capable of taking up the analysis of fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which Marx began, they bog themselves down on the terrain of bourgeois political economy, while endlessly repeating the stupidities about the law of value, work, the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, the realization of surplus value. In spite of their pretensions, they do not understand the progress of modern capitalism. Believing themselves to be obliged to use a Marxist vocabulary for which they don't possess the instructions for use, they cut themselves off from the few possibilities for analysis which still remain within political economy. Their researches are not worth those which the first disciples of Keynes produced. Ouch. I think this is an overstatement, but I also think there's a little bit of truth to it, though so many people hiding behind these ideologies from the past because they can't figure out how to progress those ideologies. They're stalled. They're always elsewhere in the past or in some other country that you're not participating in doing it. And that is a tell. It's a tell. If there's nothing for you to do here other than to idolize some past formation or to throw your lot with another country, it's because there's nothing for you to do, since you obviously don't have an effect on that country most of the time. Militants and workers' councils. The militant organizations make themselves autonomous from the masses that they claim to represent. They are naturally to consider that this is not the working class which makes a revolution, but the organizations of the working class. This is Susan to reinforce the latter. In extreme cases, the proletariat becomes mere raw material, the manure from which will bloom the red rose of the Revolutionary Party. The necessities of co-option require that they say little about this externally. This is where the demagogy begins. The autonomy of the objectives of the militant organizations must be concealed. Ideology is used for this purpose. They loudly proclaim that they are in the service of the people, that they don't act for themselves, and that if they ever were obliged to take power for a short time, they would never abuse it. Once the working class has been well educated, they would haste to return the power to them. The history of the Workers' Council shows that these so-called workers' organizations systemically sought to play their own game and extricate their own chestnuts from the fire. For the best reasons, of course. To ensure their own power that they sought to limit, co-opt, and destroy the forms of organization which the proletariat had given to itself. Territorial Soviets and factory committees. This is when they moved to the cell system too. The Russian Soviets were bribed and then liquidated by the Bolshevik Party and state. That's an overstatement. They still existed throughout most of the Soviet period. They were way weakened, but they existed and did have some real local power. In 1905, Lenin had attached no importance to them. That's true. In 1917, by contrast, the Bolsheviks claimed all power to the Soviets. In 1921, the Soviets, which had served as the stepping stones to the seizure of power, became troublesome. The workers and sailors of Kronstadt, who demanded free Soviets, were crushed by the Red Army. Kronstadt was a mixed movement, but I get the problem here. In Germany, the Social Democratic government, the People's Stewards, undertook to liquidate the workers' councils in the name of the revolution. Absolutely, they did. Eventually led to Weimar and then fascism. Once again, in Spain, the communists took care to make the forms of popular power disappear. This was done to better develop the fight against fascism. At no point in multiplying examples, all the historical experiences have confirmed the antagonism which opposes the revolutionary proletariat in the militant organization. The most extremist ideology can conceal the most counter-revolutionary position. If organizations like the Spartacist League or the anarcho-syndicalist CNTFAI could fight at the side of the proletariat until their common defeat, nothing proves that these organizations would not have started to fight for power for themselves once their opponents have been overcome. For all that they have cloistered themselves in politics, militants are no less social individuals subjected to the influence of their milieu. When things heat up, many may cross over to the revolutionary camp. After all, we have seen union representatives take charge of sequestrations. But the massive desertion of militants will be all the more likely once the councils and revolutionary councilists will be the stronger. The movement may be helped in its successes by the reinforcement of many militants, but in the event of a mistake or hesitation, the pendulum will swing in the opposite direction. The militant organizations will then be reinforced by proletarians seeking to reassure themselves. The liquidation of the Workers' Council was made possible by their weakness, their inability to apply internally the rules of direct democracy and to effectively take power without crushing all powers inside them. Militant organizations are in fact merely the proletarians' own weakness exteriorized, and thus turned against them. Ouch. Workers will make mistakes again. They will not immediately find the most appropriate form for their own power. The fewer illusions the masses have of a militancy, the more the power of the councils will have a chance to develop. So we can see that Blanc and the OJTR are definitely leading councilists. Discrediting and ridiculing the militants, this is a task that falls to the revolutionaries today. This task will be completed by criticism and deeds represented by the birth of councilist organizations. These organizations will know how to do without a leadership and a bureaucratic apparatus. At all? Okay. A product of solidarity of the combative workers, they will have free associations of autonomous individuals. They will demonstrate through their ideas, and especially by their behavior and struggle, they will never venture to pursue their own interests as distinct from those of the whole proletariat. How? How would you do that? Like, you got to be more specific on how that's going to be possible, guy. This movement of modern capitalism, which result in all social spaces being occupied by commodities and the generalization of wage labor, and also in the degradation of moral values and contempt for work and for ideologies, will increase the violence of the clash. Proletarians will go much faster and much further than they did in the past. While in the past, organizations, militants could perform a revolutionary role for a time, that will no longer be possible. And at the time of the next great battles or struggles, these organizations can become rapidly more and more counter-revolutionary. All right. So here's a little bit of context. And again, this is not separated out for whatever reason. The OJTR was formed in the early 1970s. Originally, it was inspired by the Situationist International, though it was to publish a pamphlet containing lengthy critiques of it. The SI influences can be seen in the present text. The concept of militantism develops themes which can be found in situationist writing. And the SI influence also becomes seen in its approach to councilist organizations set out in the closing paragraphs. Yes, situationalists were councilist aligned. That gets dropped a lot. Subsequently, the OJTR became influenced by left communism, in particular a mixture of German and Italian left communists that has developed in the milieu around the bookshop La Militancy, the old mall, which came to the group La Mouvement Communiste, l'AMC. The group also produced a text under the name A Quarter Million Young Workers, adopted from the 1971 PSU Youth publication. We already mentioned that. In 1974, the OJTR organized a national conference and disappeared shortly afterwards. One might reasonably wonder how far the OJTR applied its critique of militancy to itself. For the remains of the group came the text Un mode sans argent, la féministe, published as 3 pamphlets by the Friends of a Million Young Workers between 1975 and 1976. The translation has been made from the French version on the ADDL site and now also at the Communist Left site. The text refers to a number of French Trotskyists and Maoist groups. Footnotes have been added to explain the references, although footnotes were added sporadically. All right. Like a lot of stuff from the Situationist International and a lot of the French attempts at ultra-leftism, unlike its Italian or German counterparts, I often find that it's under-theorized, and given how theory-heavy French communism tends to be, I actually find that kind of funny. I think this is also true of the spectacle and situationism. It might be theorized later on by Guy Debord, but it's often not particularly strongly theorized, etc. And the militant here is kind of a free-floating concept. I mean, I get the gist of what it's talking about, but if you thought I complained about the PMC being vague, what do you think? I mean, this is almost applicable to anything one dislikes, and that's a problem. In addition to what I mentioned about Dominique Blanc's own politics, particularly in the late 70s, and negationism, which is not in this text at all, there's a certain amount of just free-floating, everyone's wrong, including us, but maybe not us, but maybe us, going on that is frustrating. We'll come back into this in part 2, which is, it goes to expand and further this out. But I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk about it in the future. Take care.